Good evening, everybody. This is the 9th Hugh Laddie lecture. And I'm pleased to say that we've kept the standard right up. From the first, I think I see the first lecturer here, to the 9th. Next year, who knows, you always say that about next year. But I have a suspicion it might be okay. Shira has kindly agreed to give this talk. The title is perhaps a little aspirational, but it must be something that everybody wants. The fiddly details of each country's copyright laws must be a bloody nuisance. And if there's a way of getting rid of those, it would be wonderful. Shira has spent quite a lot of time in this country. She even, to her eternal shame, taught at King's College. But she's repairing that now. Shira, it's your time to talk.
Thank you. I am deeply honored to be back in London to give this year's Sir Hugh Laddie lecture. And I would like to start by thanking Sir Robin and UCL for their invitation and their hospitality. Let me start, because of my current job, by making clear that I will be giving my own views rather than speaking on behalf of the US Patent and Trademark Office or the administration. Now, one thing I wanted to start by making clear, I see on some of the materials for the talk, there's a question mark at the end of the title, and not on all of the materials for the talk. So let me clarify from the beginning that the title of the talk is a question, not a statement. And I hate to disappoint the committed advocates for an international copyright code, but as you will hear, I'm not yet ready to join their ranks. We find ourselves today in a highly globalized world when it comes to the consumption of entertainment and knowledge products, the subject matter of copyright. This is the outcome of an evolution measured in centuries, which has been dramatically accelerated by the advent of digital technologies. We should not and will not downplay the continued significance of works tailored to local markets and the value of cultural diversity. But there is, without question, great demand for movies, software, books, and music that appeal broadly to consumers around the world. And I'll note that many of these are produced in the English language and designed for a mass audience comprised of multiple cultures. Reflecting the rise in globalization has been a trend toward harmonizing copyright laws through treaties, beginning in the second half of the 19th century with bilateral agreements and the now venerable Berne Convention. That trend picked up pace nearly 100 years later with enactment of the Universal Copyright Convention and a major expansion in Berne membership following the United States' belated, and you might even say tardy, accession. And it culminated in the waning years of the 20th century in the 1994 TRIPS Agreement and the 1996 WIPO Internet Treaties. Some 20 years later, calls have been made on various fronts to continue the harmonization trend. Trade negotiations addressing copyright have intensified, including bilateral agreements pursued by both the United States and the European Union, and grander multilateral projects such as the now apparently defunct Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership launched in Asia. At WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, a groundbreaking treaty has already been concluded to harmonize one copyright exception, and pressure is on to negotiate more. In Brussels, the Commission has proposed a package of instruments that would increase the harmonization of copyright throughout the European Union, and has even looked at the idea of adopting a single EU-wide copyright code. Apart from these proposals for what you might call obligatory harmonization, other factors today are promoting a de facto convergence. Ongoing interactions among governments on copyright issues often involve persuasion to adopt a particular approach, whether in the form of giving examples, intellectual appeals, or economic or political pressure. The enhanced sharing of information through the regular conduct of international conferences, educational programs, and online resources tends to produce more similar perspectives. And private sector interests with an increasingly global reach, from multinational businesses to international trade associations to coordinated networks of non-governmental organizations, all promote their own visions for copyright in countries around the world. Given all of this, the logical outcome might appear to be a global copyright law, either codified through some type of treaty or accomplished through what I've been calling de facto harmonization. Such a vision was proposed as far back as the early 19th century and, of course, more recently by academic commentators. So my question is, in today's environment, is this the goal we should be striving for? Is it essentially the copyright holy grail? I'll start by outlining the benefits conferred by harmonization and then the countervailing advantages of retaining some national flexibility. I will then try to evaluate which issues are appropriate for harmonization and in what way, taking into account the particular demands of the internet environment. And finally, I'll suggest that the optimal approach would continue the relentless march toward harmonization, but at a more abstract level, relying more on policy frameworks than on detailed and prescriptive codes. So what are the benefits of harmonization? The functional benefits relate to enabling the smooth operation of international markets without burdensome transaction costs, to use the language of economists. From a commercial perspective, harmonized laws facilitate global business and make trade more efficient. It is easier to license and disseminate works across borders without tailoring the terms to each divergent legal system. While a license grant need not track the language of statutory rights, it is important to know that the licensor owns whatever is essential to enable the desired use. In other words, a valid copyright that confers control over the relevant acts. In addition, harmonization can promote more effective international enforcement. In theory, an identical scope of rights and exceptions and identical remedies could someday form the basis for agreements allowing cross-border enforcement. Short of that, closer parallelism can minimize roadblocks and smooth the path forward. Law enforcement agencies can collaborate more easily when they have similar tools at their disposal. Shared definitions of what is protectable and what constitutes infringement can help judges and customs authorities avoid clashes of conflicting policies and make mutual recognition of judgments more feasible. Other benefits relate to the instrumental goal of enhancing levels of creation and to promoting the adoption of normative values for their own sake. Most would agree that creators deserve reward for their investment of skill and labor, not only in their home countries, but anywhere that their works are enjoyed. To give a personal example, many years ago, a faculty colleague showed me a letter from a professor in China praising his treatise on international business transactions and informing him cheerfully that his admiration had inspired him to translate the treatise and sell it throughout China. Since at that time China did not protect foreign copyrights, I had to tell him that nothing could be done. This strikes all of us as unfair. It is a classic case of reaping where someone else has sown. A lack of comparable protection across borders also lessens incentives for the creation of valuable works that can be disseminated domestically. It allows cheaper imports to undercut the market of local creators, and in effect, it caps the potential worldwide rewards for the foreign creators. We should support such incentives and rewards for creators in every country, even if we assume that their works might never be exported. This ultimately benefits all of humanity in furthering the development of culture and knowledge, The more works that are created, no matter where, the richer the stock that subsequent creators can learn from and build on. And of course, once the host country itself begins to have an economic interest in exporting its own creators' work, it stands to realize real value from reciprocal protections. And that, for example, has been the experience in China, which did begin to protect foreign works later in the 1990s. Normative values, too, support carving out appropriate exceptions in each country for consumers and other users of copyrighted works. Few would argue that a copyright owner's control should be absolute, or that public interest objectives or market failures can never justify unauthorized use. Beneficial activities such as criticism, news reporting, education, research, or uses too minor or numerous to be bargained for are the subject of virtually universal concern. On the other hand, a number of considerations do militate in favor of retaining national flexibility. There has long been a recognition that one copyright size may not fit all, as domestic policies can vary significantly. Countries have different legal systems, different stakeholder interests, and different levels of economic development. Diverse policies often stem from strongly held views and fundamental national goals. For example, a belief in authors' natural rights may support expansive moral rights or narrow exceptions. Or a country without a thriving publishing industry may seek to ensure a supply of textbooks in native language translation to educate its population. Flexibility also allows countries to experiment. They may wish to implement new ideas, such as Canada's approach to orphan works, adopted well before the issue became a mainstream concern. They may find innovative solutions to challenges of new technology that is developing in their country. They may be able to improve on existing solutions, drawing on experiences at home or experiences elsewhere. This could be said of orphan work systems subsequent to Canada's, or to the application of Nordic extended collective licensing mechanisms to the modern phenomenon of mass digitization. Moreover, flexibility accommodates the separate roles of the legislature and the judiciary in adapting existing law to meet unforeseen challenges. Avoiding great detail in international obligations leaves space for domestic policy evolution. Otherwise, negotiators risk tying the hands of policymakers at home, freezing the state of the law, and impairing desirable adjustments as circumstances change. For example, critics in the United States have warned that the specificity of some of the copyright provisions in US free trade agreements could constrain congressional consideration of changes to the Copyright Act. So how do we decide what level of harmonization is appropriate where? Let's start by reviewing the traditional structure of international copyright, and I'll have to simplify somewhat. The current version of the Berne Convention and subsequent treaties, ranging from the TRIPS agreement to the WIPO 96 internet treaties to bilateral free trade agreements, are based on the same fundamental architecture. Non-discriminatory treatment for creators from other contracting parties, plus a set of minimum rights, and freedom to adopt reasonable exceptions, generally within the limits of an outside boundary on scope. That boundary, known as the three-step test, confines permissible exceptions to certain special cases that do not conflict with a normal exploitation of the work and do not unreasonably prejudice the legitimate interests of the author or right holder. Berne's architecture, as described in detail by Professors Sam Ricketson and Jane Ginsberg, embodies a compromise between a vision of universality and a pragmatic recognition of pre-existing national divergences. While rights and exceptions are treated differently from this perspective, there is neither complete harmonization of rights, just a floor, nor complete flexibility for exceptions, just a ceiling. And of course, it's worth noting that Berne does make a few rights optional and a few exceptions mandatory. In recent years, we haven't altered this fundamental architecture, but we have moved in the direction of more specificity. A more elaborate structure has developed piecemeal, primarily through trade negotiations driven by national economic priorities rather than some overall guiding philosophy. In the US trade agreements, many of these provisions track very closely the language of our Copyright Act. In the area of enforcement, pre-TRIPS agreements had very few specific obligations. Berne, for example, leaves enforcement to domestic law, although it does require the remedy of seizure of infringing copies. TRIPS broke new ground. It not only set out general obligations to provide enforcement procedures permitting effective action against infringement, including expeditious remedies to prevent infringement and remedies that constitute a deterrent to further infringement, but it also established an extensive list of civil, administrative, border, and criminal remedies to be made available. Later US trade agreements have added still more detail on enforcement matters, such as prohibitions on camcording and limitations on remedies available against internet service providers. Copyright-specific treaties concluded at WIPO, however, have remained unobtrusive in the enforcement area, generally confining themselves to a single broadly phrased article modeled on the TRIPS general obligations. So the compromise embedded in Berne's architecture has endured for many years now. And the question is, given the lessons of time and experience, the expansion of global trade, and the development of digital technology, does it need updating or rethinking? So I will look at three areas. I will look at rights, at exceptions and limitations, and at approaches to curbing infringement. I'm not going to call it enforcement because it's broader than that. I'll talk a little bit about the role of intermediaries generally. Now, I did want to make one point before discussing those three topics. It's important to recognize that the techniques for achieving the desired level of harmonization may vary. Harmonizing at any level need not be the result of treaty obligations, whether they're bilateral or multilateral. It may develop organically through soft law, such as agreed principles or recommendations, one of the techniques used at WIPO at times, or through de facto convergence, as I've mentioned. And each of these can be effective, and each of them offers different advantages and disadvantages. So, for example, multilateral agreements, by definition, can achieve a very broad level of harmonization more quickly, broad scope of harmonization. Trade negotiations, on the other hand, allow the application of external commercial leverage, whether for good or for bad, and they're more likely to establish mechanisms for effectively resolving disputes. De facto convergence or soft law provides maximum national discretion within the harmonization concept, but also provides little mutual certainty, although each of them can lay the groundwork for eventual binding agreements. I see this as a process. So to turn to the topic of rights, those economic rights that have been deemed critical historically and guaranteed as treaty minima relate either to the making of copies or to performances or other types of communication to the public. Some versions of these two types of rights exist in almost every copyright law, with the greatest variations found in the scope of the public performance and communication rights. Over time, they've been refined or supplemented to respond to commercially significant new uses that might fall outside their borders, notably by adding translation rights and rights to control distribution of copies or making works available to the public on demand. Moral rights, which by definition are more normative than commercial, tend to vary more from country to country, with the rights of attribution and integrity forming the common core and considerable divergence in application and interpretation. The newest internationally recognized additions, which may be viewed as technological adjuncts to copyright, are the rights to prevent circumvention of technological protection measures, or TPMs, and the right to prevent interference with the integrity of rights management information, or RMI. Both originated in the 1996 WIPO Internet treaties in a break from the usual US and EU practice of negotiating treaty obligations to match existing internal law. They've since become standard provisions, certainly in US trade agreements, moving from the general obligations articulated in the WIPO treaties to a detailed code mirroring the US implementation of those obligations. Now, from a functional perspective, it makes sense to keep the current international treaty structure of minimum required levels of protection. As I noted earlier, the smooth operation of global markets requires the ability to count on certain basic rights. They need to be similar enough to license cross-border uses without extensive research or tailored treatment. And this should include protection for TPMs and RMIs as they help keep copyright rights meaningful in the digital world. And it's not feasible, or at least not efficient, to apply these technologies differently to copies of works made available in different countries. Now, does this mean we've reached the optimal level of harmonization of rights? The fast pace of technological and market change and experience that many of us have had, many countries have had, with courts struggling to define the borders of specific rights, suggests that a less detailed approach could be preferable. US courts, for example, have split in their interpretations of how the Copyright Act's distribution and public performance rights apply to the new on-demand offerings. International treaties could, in theory, instead obligate signatories simply to offer adequate protection against any act of unauthorized exploitation, without specifying what types of acts these need to be. And indeed, there are some laws that do just that, avoiding the need for continual updates to respond to technological change and the risk that new uses may fall through the cracks before change can be made. But copyright's history has been one of granting specific rights, and this is an approach that has some appeal from the perspective of both owners and users. On the one hand, it does ensure that meaningful forms of exploitation will be covered, that courts will understand that they are intended to be covered. And on the other hand, it limits the extent of protection to those areas where it has shown to be needed. So it cabins the scope of protection. And it simply may not be practical at this point to embark on a project of transforming that part of the established international foundation. With TPMs and RMI as newer forms of rights, adaptation should be easier. We could focus more on a framework and less on requiring specific mechanisms. In other words, more detail than the 1996 WIPO treaties, which are very general, but less than the bilateral US free trade agreements. And countries have developed different ways under their own legal and regulatory systems to ensure the continued viability of exceptions and limitations when TPMs are applied, albeit some approaches more acceptable than others, at least from my perspective. In the United States, we have a triennial rulemaking procedure done by the Library of Congress and the Copyright Office. And in the UK, I understand there's a system for complaints to be submitted to the Secretary of State when TPMs prevent the ability to benefit from an exception. Now, this could be an area where experimentation within a guiding policy framework could produce a range of positive results. And such a higher level approach has now, in fact, been conceived of. You can find that in both the 2012 Beijing Treaty, if you look at Agreed Statement 15, and more recently, the text of the TPP, and for anyone who wants to take notes, Article 18.68, Paragraph 4. So both of these allow parties to adopt certain measures to ensure that non-infringing uses can continue to be made despite the application of TPMs under appropriate circumstances, including consideration of any steps taken by right holders to enable such use. These provisions avoid weakening the prohibition against circumvention by establishing necessary conditions to be met, without, however, dictating the specific procedures that have to be followed. And if you read that provision in the TPP, you'll see that it adds an explicit safeguard imposing an outside limit against measures that undermine the effectiveness of TPM, comparable to the three-step test for exceptions and limitations. So to turn to exceptions and limitations. This is the area of the greatest divergence in national laws. Now again, this divergence predates the international copyright treaties, but it has so far been permitted to continue in large part. This is not surprising because it is the exceptions and limitations to rights that carve out their breadth and reach and that generally embody very strongly held national policies. For example, what types of libraries should be able to make how many copies in what formats, and in what ways can they make them available to patrons? What types of performances can be made without permission to what audiences in schools or churches? There is a push today for greater harmonization of exceptions and limitations, with multilateral norm setting often proposed as a technique. And a number of arguments are brought to bear. First, it's been pointed out that under the current approach of flexibility within outside limits, a country could choose to have virtually no exceptions. I was going to say none, but only the limited ones required by Berne. And that result, by definition, could be seen as unbalanced. Second argument is that exceptions may be seen as the flip side of rights, integrally linked to rights. It is both combined that define the contours of protection. So the argument goes that they should be given equal prominence and equal attention in treaties. And finally, and I always find this point interesting, for some countries, generally in the developing world, it is only the impetus of an international treaty that engages the political process to produce domestic legislation. Now, the contexts in which these arguments are made include both IP-specific negotiations and trade negotiations. So at WIPO, we've seen regional groups of developing countries urge the negotiation of new treaties, focusing on exceptions and limitations for libraries and archives and for educational organizations. And after the ground was broken for the first minimum exceptions instrument in 2013 with the Marrakesh Treaty, the debate has focused on whether this should be seen as a sui generis approach in the disabilities context or a precedent for future work. In the TPP discussions, conversations about how to treat exceptions led to an unprecedented provision endorsing the normative goal of balance. And of course, the TPP negotiations involved 12 countries at very different levels of development. So again, Article 18.66 is entitled Balance in Copyright and Related Rights Systems, and it requires countries to endeavor to achieve an appropriate balance by means of exceptions and limitations consistent with the three-step test, giving due consideration to legitimate purposes such as those listed in the US Fair Use Statute. Now, a different pro-harmonization movement, which has been championed by a number of US stakeholders and international academics, is seeking to persuade countries around the world to adopt at national level an American-style fair use doctrine. And proponents of this movement are generally not supportive of minimum exceptions treaties at WIPO. They prefer the broader, more flexible fair use approach. This movement has already had some success with countries from Israel to Singapore amending their copyright laws to incorporate fair use, and others such as Australia considering doing so. The United States over the centuries has certainly benefited from the adaptability of fair use, and the question is how well that doctrine can be transposed into other legal systems that do not have the same body of precedent and perhaps don't have a system of common law. And interestingly, Israel has decided to draw on US jurisprudence to incorporate its own fair use doctrine. Now, greater harmonization of exceptions is also a linchpin of the pending copyright proposals in the EU Digital Single Market Initiative. And it's interesting to watch this regional context, which provides in some ways a laboratory for evaluating the impact of different levels of harmonization and how they may change over time. So of course, apart from very few mandatory exceptions in various directives, member states may currently choose from an a la carte list of permissible exceptions and have a fair amount of room in implementation. In the DSM copyright package, the Commission is proposing to harmonize a number of exceptions further, specifically to enhance certainty for uses involving new technologies and to ensure the ability to make cross-border uses. But even in the context of a single regional market, which is of course quite different from the global context, the Commission has not determined and the EU has not determined that complete harmonization is the ideal approach. So given the even greater diversity of cultures and economies that exist around the world, I would propose that it's still desirable to retain national flexibility to define the borders of protection and to accommodate domestic policies. At the same time, the current debates do suggest giving more weight to normative goals. The international framework could be improved by making clear that adopting only the stingiest of exceptions should not be acceptable. And as was done in the TPP negotiations, we may be able to reach consensus on the goal of achieving appropriate balances with some autonomy in precisely how to do so, of course, within the constraints of the three-step test. And within that type of framework, a greater degree of harmonization could still be achieved by adopting high-level principles and objectives at the international level. And that's the approach that's been proposed by the United States at WIPO and the Standing Committee on Copyright and Related Rights, the SCCR. So just to give an example, in the area of library exceptions, we've proposed as an objective to enable libraries and archives to carry out their public service role of preserving works. And then we've suggested that be supported by a principle endorsing exceptions to enable the making of copies for purposes of preservation and replacement in a variety of media and formats under appropriate circumstances. So if there is agreement that certain principles and objectives are appropriate, countries would remain free to craft their own implementations, again, as consistent with the three-step test. Now, this still leaves the question of whether this impairs the functionality of global markets, these divergences. So while divergent exceptions are workable in a world where uses take place in a single country, where you're talking about physical copies, there are a lot of demands today for online and cross-border circulation of copies. For the distribution of physical goods, control can be exercised, at least to some extent, through customs barriers. For legitimate online markets, one possibility is tailored geo-blocking to accommodate differing standards. And in the copyright world, this technique has been used to enforce exclusive territoriality and licenses. It's also used, of course, more broadly, especially in Europe, to address distinctive laws such as hate speech and the so-called right to be forgotten. But geo-blocking is not popular with consumers and with politicians who are championing their interests, and it's given rise to the proposed regulation in the EU that would limit its use. But I will say the more laws diverge, the more geo-blocking could prove to be an important defensive technique. And then, final point on exceptions and limitations, there are some humanitarian reasons to export certain copies to countries that don't have the resources to produce them themselves. In circumstances where there are adequate safeguards, special mechanisms could be developed to allow cross-border exchange. And key would be the involvement of trustworthy institutional actors and targeted formats or uses that are limited in their scope or appeal. The mechanisms must not become a backdoor for making works available to a general audience and interfering with normal markets. And this type of system has now been established, in fact, for cross-border exchanges of accessible format copies of books under the Marrakesh Treaty. And discussions are currently underway in the WIPO SCCR of whether any similar system would be possible or make sense for libraries lending works from their collections across borders. So third and last topic, curbing infringement. The territorial nature of copyright is particularly problematic for the distribution of works and the protection of rights in the online environment. Legitimate distribution chains as well as infringement chains are now global and fast-moving. And in this area, there are calls from both right holders and from intermediaries in some circumstances to find a way to make national systems less disjunctive and avoid separate enforcement enclaves. For right holders, the international dimension of online enforcement poses considerable difficulties. Advances in both broadband internet penetration and compression technology have changed the paradigm of how infringement takes place. It is now dispersed and decentralized, with the relevant acts occurring simultaneously around the world. So the operator of a typical infringing streaming site may live in one country while the website is hosted in a second country, with the files hosted on a cloud service in a third country. And the domain name under which the site operates may be controlled by a registry in yet a fourth country. Once the website is launched, the works are freely available for users to stream everywhere without any reliance on local distributors other than the internet access provider. While remedies that can block foreign websites are available in some jurisdictions, they are not in all, including the United States, and they still require a lawsuit in each country where the blocking is sought. So how can we develop practical solutions? To achieve effective results in the context of this type of multinational infringement, the role of intermediaries is increasingly key. Intermediaries have always played a role in moving copyrighted works from their creators to their audiences, but the online environment has given rise to new types of intermediaries with expanded functions, and the list is growing day by day. These intermediaries range from the mere conduits and hosting sites and search engines that were contemplated by the US Digital Millennium Copyright Act back in 1998, a very long time ago, to today's lockers and cloud services and social media sites. And the impact and reach of these services mean that they can be instrumental in helping to curb infringement. At the same time, the risk of legal responsibility for the content being transmitted could be crippling to these services given the sheer speed and volume that they entail. And internationally, divergent exceptions combined with discrepancies in liability regimes could disrupt the functioning of their businesses and the seamless operation of global markets. So I would say approaches to the role of intermediaries therefore merit some level of harmonization as well. I think we need meaningful incentives for cooperation, although they can be articulated differently. It is their existence rather than their form that matters. Many countries, including the United States, have systems of secondary liability which differ in detail but often lead to similar results on similar facts. Other jurisdictions require steps to be taken to control infringement in some circumstances independent of any risk of liability. And here I'm thinking, for example, of Article 8.3 of the Information Society Directive, which ensures the availability of injunctions without any showing of fault, which hopefully removes the need for contentious litigation to obtain effective action. Now, safe harbors, too, should be similar enough to allow smooth cross-border transmissions. And to some extent, we have that framework today, but its global reach is not yet comprehensive. So the safe harbors that were adopted in the United States in 1998 have been incorporated in large part in the e-commerce directive, and a number of other countries have created similar structures. Some have done so independently and others pursuant to trade agreement obligations. Now, if compatible notice and takedown procedures are available everywhere, they can be partly automated, they can be used more efficiently, especially with respect to multinational businesses communicating with each other. Now, in contrast, I think inconsistent approaches, such as Canada's notice and notice system, can make global enforcement more difficult. Now, texts in US trade agreements have promoted the harmonization of ISP safe harbors, starting with very detailed provisions that mirrored US law in the Korea-US Free Trade Agreement, which was later carried over into other bilateral FTAs. But by the time the TPP was negotiated with those 12 very varied economies, some of the parties had already developed their own frameworks. These were consistent in broad outlines, but had operational details that were tailored to local contexts. So, for example, in Japan, a process for reviewing notices had been established with a prompter response available when the notice came from a trusted sender. And as a result, in the TPP negotiations, a less prescriptive and more principle-based approach was adopted. And again, for anyone who's taking notes, it's Article 18.81. So I think we need to recognize that not all of the enforcement challenges can be addressed through legal harmonization, or at least not in the short term. Meanwhile, voluntary cooperation between different industry sectors can supplement these legal efforts and ease some of the difficulties. In the United States, various stakeholders have come together over the past years to develop private initiatives aimed at curbing online infringement, and these include advertising networks and payment providers, and are sometimes referred to as a follow-the-money approach, which is aimed at starving illegal operators of funds. Other countries, notably the UK, have also seen value in this type of approach. So, how does all this add up? Copyright harmonization has gone through different phases over time. The initial international architecture was established by Berne, minimum rights and space for exceptions. The second phase, which involved the incorporation of copyright into the discipline of trade negotiations in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, followed the direction of trade imperatives toward increased specificity in rights and in enforcement mechanisms. And today, we may be entering a third phase, addressing a wider range of issues, but at a higher level of generality. So I see this as a positive direction. It can mean continued harmonization through minimum rights, expanded to cover technological adjuncts, but with less specificity. It can mean a new harmonization of at least some exceptions and limitations, but at the level of goals and principles. And it can mean improved harmonization of approaches to online infringement, including both legal incentives and safe harbors for intermediaries, while allowing more flexibility in the processes and methods used. Now, we may someday have a truly global copyright law, but that is only likely to happen when the world itself is more harmonized in terms of economies, in terms of legal systems, and philosophies of reward for creativity. Meanwhile, I hope we can move toward better harmonized frameworks that ensure functional markets and at the same time promote important norms while preserving reasonable space for countries to experiment and to diverge. Thank you.
"144 years ago, the greatest lawyer produced by this university, Sir George Jessel, said in a judgment dealing with a man importing piratical works from the United States, who said he didn't know that they were piratical, but he is in the trade, and everybody in the trade must be taken to know that works of American origin are piratical." Things have moved on, haven't they, Shira?
Things have moved on. Things have moved on.
We've had an extraordinary talk which will require quite a bit of digestion, which you can do because it will appear on the website and it's been streamed tonight. Probably some people said, hell with this, I'm going home, sit in the garden and watch it there.
With a drink.
Yes. Shira, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
You've kept the standard of the Laddie lectures up there. You can't get any higher than that. All we can do is to thank you very much again and go across the road. I don't know if there's a north or south cloisters, but it's one or the other where the drinks are.
Thank you.
Just before we go, does anybody have any questions? I know it's hot and whatnot, but does anybody have any questions or comments? I thought not. Does anybody, really, serious, does anybody have anything?
This one.
Oh, yeah, okay.
You began by mentioning the difficulty of doing contracts.
Have you got a mic?
Speak very loudly.
Run.
You mentioned the problems of doing contracts right at the beginning of your talk. And a very simple one is if you have joint ownership of copyright, what it means in the UK and what it means in the US is different.
Yeah.
That applies to patents as well. But that's a very simple example of something where if you're contracting, you've got to watch what you're doing.
Yeah. No, absolutely. In fact, I had a section on ownership, but deleted it in the interest of time. Very good point.
Amanda?
I've always been rather interested that the actual wording of the safe harbor legislation in the US legislation is mimicked subsequently so closely by the EU. Mm-hmm. And I wondered whether America had had any input into it, or whether it's just the complement of borrowing or mimicry, because from a commercial perspective, it seems to me that the predominant benefit has attached to American corporations.
That's interesting. There was a lot of bilateral discussion about why we had done it that way, what it meant, how that could be adapted in the European context. At the time, a lot of the American corporations who were talking about being benefited didn't even exist, or were tiny. So I don't think there was any sense of we were talking about competitive advantage or disadvantage. There was more of a concern just to make sure that the transatlantic marketplace could function smoothly. Of course, there are some differences. For example, in the US, those rules apply only to copyright, not to other areas, whereas in the EU, it's horizontal. And there's no specific safe harbor for search engines. Yes, exactly. And it'd be interesting. I'm sure there are academic articles talking about how the search engine liability issue has evolved differently in both areas, which I'd be interested to read.
Jonathan.
Shira, you raise a number of very important issues and suggest approaches for tackling them. But I'm wondering, how should the decision be made as to whether to adopt the approaches you suggest or some other approaches? Should it be a matter for, should be based on the views of experts such as yourself and Robin? Or should people go out there and try and find some evidence from how things work in practice as to, and try and quantify the benefits or disbenefits of adopting particular approaches? Or is that kind of evidence likely to be a waste of time and not worth the expense of gathering it and so on?
I think the evidence would be extremely useful. I think all policymakers are increasingly aware of the value of evidence-based rulemaking. It's always difficult to find useful, unbiased, compelling evidence, but we need to be looking at that. I would say my perspective is very much from someone who has worked in industry, in government, in academia, and I'm looking at this thinking, what can work in terms of thinking about the international system? That doesn't mean it will happen, because that's not generally what countries have in mind as they start to negotiate these agreements. But I think it doesn't hurt to make those points, to be thinking about those points, even if they may be more aspirational than what actually happens day to day. And it may be that in the long run, the evidence will show and experience will show that this is a more effective way to proceed with my idea of pervasive but moderate harmonization, if I can put it that way.
I've got my own comment there, if I may.
Okay.
The British Patent Office said they wanted to be evidence-based, but it consisted, as far as I could see, in listening to the people who shouted loudest.
So the question I wanted to ask was the extent to which your proposed approach informs the dynamic that you discussed between, on the one hand, copyright treaty making, and on the other hand, free trade agreements. Mm-hmm. Does your approach favour copyright treaties, or does it favour free trade agreements, or is it agnostic between the two?
It's a good question, and I'm going to have to think about that. I partly think it's, in theory, I might have said it favors copyright treaties, but looking at the experience with the TPP, I would say it's more agnostic, because to the extent you start to negotiate trade agreements where you have very different kinds of countries negotiating with each other, that may, and there's more of an imperative in a trade agreement to reach a conclusion than there is, for example, in negotiations at WIPO. At WIPO, we negotiate agreements for 20 years without an outcome. Not always, but sometimes. In a trade agreement, the negotiators who are IP experts are in the room under instructions from their government to find solutions, because there's a desire to open trade. And so sometimes things move faster, and to the extent you have very divergent perspectives in the room, as there's more trade agreements between countries at different levels of development and with different backgrounds, you may be able to move faster toward what we did in the TPP, which is somewhat more harmonization of exceptions and a higher level of harmonization, for example, for safe harbors and TPM protection.
If I can just have a quick follow-up on that. As you yourself pointed out, both Marrakesh and Beijing were successfully concluded, whereas you yourself said TPP is dead.
It was successfully concluded, but of course there was a change in political leadership. So it's a political question whether a country still wants to participate. One of the reasons I was a little bit vague about the status of TPP is I do understand that some, if not all, of the other negotiating parties are interested in continuing it and reviving it. So it may not be dead, it just is unlikely to include the US.
Right, I think it's Drinky's time. Thank you again.
Thank you.